All right. Hi, Nene.
Hi, Vicky. How are you again?
I'm good. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, we sit on these Zoom platforms, hey?
I know.
Hey, the whole day.
Yeah. I think
It's
it's more.
actually, after this COVID thing, it's actually something else is being created that's not normal. Because when I go to work, when I knock off, I get into my car and drive. Here, I sit the whole day in the chair because I'm at home. It's not actually normal.
Actually, you're right, Nene.
Yeah.
You know, from a psychological aspect, when you go to work and you knock off work, and then you get into your car and drive home, that is what we call it the transition for switch.
Yes.
And your brain recognizes that you've a transition and you have switched. And actually your brain switches. So now your brain is having challenges switching off work and then switching to a new mode, and therefore activating a new neural pathway to start the home activities. You know, your routinized process with the brain. So actually it is true, and that is what is increasing so much stress for so many.
I've been sitting since 8:30 on this chair.
Yeah.
I just stand up to drink water and it's not okay, you know?
Yeah. I'm also struggling. I'm just thinking, God, goodness. Like I've been here since we started with you guys.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I've just been Zoom call. Tomorrow I must get out. That's what I keep
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been I think one of the ways that is good is to encourage people if certain things can be done on phone and not on Zoom. Because it's like we have defaulted to Zoom all the time.
Days,
even things that can be done.
Can we Zoom? Everyone says, can we Zoom? What happened?
Even with one person. Even with one person.
Yeah.
I have someone who called me and told me, hey, hi, can we go to Google Meet? I was like, for what?
Yeah, let's talk.
Just finish talking.
Yeah, there was no presentation, no nothing.
Yeah.
And we were on, and after a while I said, this could have been done on phone. Oh yes, really? I'm like, yes. Could have been.
But it's a, you know, Vicky, it's also human nature. We tend to be excited with a newfound toy, if I can use that metaphor.
Yes.
So
for everything. Yeah.
And it's
so Zoom is like a newfound toy.
It's gonna irritate us too. Yeah.
Exactly.
And the only way to feel you're not missing in action is to actually be in a Zoom call.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. My husband is not in very many Zoom calls. So when he lands a Zoom call, he's like, shh.
Yeah. While before he could take a phone call without telling everybody, shh.
I know.
Yeah. I'm like, shh. I'm like, God. And then it's even a reunion. So I've been laughing.
Yeah.
Like, wow.
Yeah, it's a social Zoom call. Yeah? It's a social Zoom call.
Yeah, it's a social Zoom call. Shh.
Really? Why?
Yeah, I'm like, why? I mean, surely.
Yeah.
Like, but you people always, I'm like, if you knew how we hate Zoom calls. He's not a Zoom call person, but when it happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
So funny. I find it so funny.
Yeah. I think it will bring it will bring some good things, like, for example, I'm hoping that employers will see the need of creating much more flexi time, especially for women, because then it helps them to also, I mean, like we always say, women pay a very hefty inclusion tax. You know, it's for them to be included, they have to pay an inclusion tax in so many obvious and subtle ways. So what has been happening is that they never have flexi time to be able to tend to their, children, even though, again, we are actually urging men to also share household chores and childcare, but truly the employers can see, so we can actually allow the bulk of our women with families and young children and who want to, or even fathers to do so.
Hi,
To do so. Hi, Sam. To do so because they've seen that it is actually doable. And it has actually helped many organizations improve their HR policies and see that actually whatever they were seeing as if it was so impossible, or the organization or the employees themselves were not ready for it, they are now actually ready for it.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah. And the cost factor.
The what?
The cost factor. The fact that you can reduce your overheads in terms of office space.
Yeah.
And other things. Yeah.
It's true. It's very,
absolutely.
Very
yeah.
You can do away with so many things that you really didn't. You just kept filing, but not really adding value.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
I feel for people who are in the property business, because big offices are no longer here in Johannesburg. Huge offices are empty. And because people are working from home, and I don't think it's gonna go back to 100% as it was.
Yeah.
So office letting is not as lucrative as it used to be.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely. They'll have to also they'll have to relook into their revenue models and really their operating models in the real estate. And many other organizations will have to do it. But actually, as you've said, real estate is really affected.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's gonna be sad. Same here, I think. For a lot
and you know something else, I was actually having a conversation with one of the CEOs, and we were discussing about the talent market, especially for the small to medium enterprises.
Yeah.
And we actually realized that many of the organizations that are laying off staff, they are laying them off not because necessarily of COVID per se. They are laying off their high earning staff because they can actually employ for the same position with less, because there is actually a saturation of talent in the market right now. You can actually let go somebody who was earning 500,000 or 1 million Kenya shillings and recruit at 700 or 300,000 Kenya shillings, the same talent, the same competencies, because now there's actually really a saturation of really qualified and good talent, actually. Yeah. Interestingly enough. So you'll find there are those who are laying them off because, you know, they cannot afford the wage bill for real, because their revenues have really gone down. Others are actually taking advantage and leveraging this COVID crisis to actually reduce their wage bill and hire qualified talent at a lesser pay. And what this will do in the next 1 year or 2 years, maximum 3 years, has the curve plateaus in terms of wage bill, is actually then normalize the wage market and the wage bill, especially where it had escalated and unreasonably, and become overly expensive. I don't know what you have noticed about this.
There's been a lot of escalations. You know, also that holds true to property. It's for property, same for talent. It had gone to I guess not a sustainable level. It was not sustainable. It
is true. It is true. There was a time, there was a survey, actually. I'm trying to remember which organization had done that survey, and saying that Kenya is one of the most expensive markets in terms of talent, and wage bill. We are paying way above, especially at senior management level. We could be matching other countries at the entry jobs, but when you start now at the upper middle management to C-suite, it's overly way ahead. We've actually pulled way ahead of many African markets. And multinationals will tell you that they are paying more in this market than they are paying in other markets in terms of wage bill. And what that has cost is then also other people who are entering this market, not for talent, but now to sell stuff. They've also been putting the price of whatever they're selling high, because they know there's a middle class that can afford it.
Everything goes.
Yes.
Everything goes
up. I hope it will then normalize some, hopefully.
I guess there had to be an equalizer at some point somewhere.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's very true. There's too much talent. I remember what a friend of mine who works for the UN was telling me he can't even do these exams they do so that you get an international
For career progression.
There are just too many Kenyans. They don't even pick, as in if you're picked as a Kenyan, you have to be, I don't know, exceptional, because there's so many qualified people that it becomes fair to the other countries, to the
exactly.
countries
If you're looking for technical qualifications.
Yes, it becomes very unfair.
Which are offered by those exams.
Yeah.
And of course, other extra things like masters, PhD.
Exactly. So now they have to have a policy where they allow for other people to be included without necessarily having the same qualifications, because you can't beat the people who are here by their very nature. Yeah. So that's what's going to happen, I think.
Yeah. Great. Okay. I hope we have. Now, how many people have registered, by the way?
I haven't checked. By morning, it was about 52.
Okay. I hope they've begun coming in so that our time is also well up.
Ready. I start letting people in.
Okay.
Yeah, we're good. Okay, so letting people in. Okay, welcome everyone to this webinar titled Creating Inclusive Organizations and Communities by Tackling Unconscious Bias. We are letting in people slowly, one by one. It seems like we'll take about maybe another 2 to 3 minutes. So please allow us another 2 to 3 minutes to have a bit more quorum for this webinar. So I'll ask Nene and Mary to just give us a few more minutes as we see who's coming in. Thank you.
That's fine. Thank you.
When you come in, just mute your mics for good order. If you can also just put off your video. And at the end of the session, we'll give you a chance, if you raise your hand, if you would want to share, and we have enough time. Also, we'll have the chat box where you can put in your comments as we go along. Sorry, Nene, have I muted you? Okay.
Now I'm good.
Yeah, I had
Thank you.
the unmute button. So once again, if you're just joining us, welcome to this webinar titled Creating Inclusive Organizations and Communities by Tackling Unconscious Bias. Give us a few minutes to just let people come in slowly. So we will start in about a minute or so. Yes. So this session is being recorded as well. So we'll share it out in the end. Let's see how many more people we get. Okay, welcome everyone again, those who just joined us. My name is Vicky Karuga, hosting for Current Country Club. Today's webinar is on creating inclusive organizations and communities by tackling unconscious bias. I know there were a few questions that were sent in and a few people who are very, very happy that we were covering this topic today. I think we just have people who, it's been a slow day. It's not a golf day though, so people are joining in slowly. But let me just start by just introducing you briefly. Mary. Mary will be actually she'll be hosting the show together with Nene, who's from South Africa. And both of them are experts in the topic of inclusion, equity, diversity, and of course the topic of unconscious bias, which I think brings them all together, as Washeke was telling me earlier on, a topic that for me, I'm not an expert in, but I'm really eager to understand more. And joining us is also Nene, who Washeke will also introduce to us shortly. So let me hand over to you, Mary, so that you can start this session. I think as people run along, I'll keep posting on the chats the house rules, and also ask people to ask questions on the chat. And we will also have 2 polls that are running for you as the session is going on, for you to vote, so we can understand a few things about unconscious bias. So over to you, Mary. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Vicky, for allowing us to have this webinar. And also thank you very much to the management of Current Country Club. We are also very grateful for those who have actually then registered for this webinar and are willing to have this conversation on diversity and inclusion. The conversation of diversity and inclusion is an everyday conversation, even though many times we don't tend to engage with it because it's a bit emotive, and we will see why it becomes emotive. My guest panelist today is Nene Molefi, and I would like to introduce her. She is the CEO and founder of Mandate Molefi HR Consultants in South Africa. She is a consultant, a facilitator. She's also an international speaker in the space of strategy, issues of diversity and inclusion. And one of the biggest projects she's done, and a key one, is hosting and leading and designing and facilitating the social cohesion dialogues in South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa, and especially for the judicial system, the high courts in South Africa, the Supreme Court and the Constitutional Court, on the issues of diversity and inclusion. Nene is also a published author. She has a book called A Journey of Diversity and Inclusion in South Africa, Guidelines for Leading Inclusively. And indeed, we must admit, we need inclusive leaders especially this time when we are so polarized in the world and deeply divided, even at the lowest level, granular levels of families and communities. The issue of inclusivity and inclusive leadership is very, very critical and important. She's a guest lecturer also at the Gordon Institute of Business and Thabo Mbeki African Leadership. I would like to say that I actually met Nene 3 years ago, and we've had a very good journey with Nene. We met in Princeton for a program on diversity and inclusion and futuristic thinking in terms of diversity issues to do with sustainability, artificial intelligence, socioeconomic factors, and global changes that are happening and how they will affect the issue of diversity and inclusion. And then, of course, last year, I was privileged to be with Nene in a panel again at Academy of Management in Boston, where we were discussing the issue of diversity and inclusion and where the effect of sustainability, climate change, the issues we are seeing globally and how they will affect diversity and inclusion and human progress in this issue. So this year we are working on, we sit in a panel together with Nene, where she's a co-author of the Global Diversity and Inclusion Benchmarks, and I'm a panelist, as an expert panelist in that report for 2021 all the way to 2025. And Nene is also my team leader on socio-economic factors and global issues on diversity and inclusion. So I'm actually very happy today to host Nene and to have her in our panel. And she will bring us really experience from South Africa, which is an African country where we share some similarities and of course some differences because of their journey post-apartheid. In our country, of course, we are going to be looking at more issues that are emotive to us, the issues of human development and inclusion in workplaces, and issues like ethnicity, which is really an issue in African country. So to take us into this conversation, I would like to take a few minutes to frame this conversation by actually asking us, what is diversity? What is inclusion? We hear words like equity, equality, belonging, all the social sifting. What do we mean by it? Stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, implicit prejudice, and explicit. What are all these? So just for us to frame the conversation so that we are able to also effectively contribute and engage with this conversation, is to say that diversity is actually the factors and characteristics that make us different, that make us unique, either as individuals or a group of people. That is what we call diversity. It is factors and characteristics of similarities or differences between people and groups of people. And these factors could be things like personal attributes and personality traits that give the self-identity. But it could also be factors of social identity, things like skin color, race, age, gender, religion, culture, marital status, political ideologies, belief systems. All these things that give us identities, collective identities, also are really part of diversity. Other issues could be socioeconomic issues, because we tend to categorize people and to put them in boxes of socioeconomic measures, whether middle class, lower middle class, upper, lower, whatever we want to categorize people. It could be geopolitical factors. It could be cognitive factors, actually. Things like skills and competencies and qualifications that make us different. And this one, we see it very evidently at the place of work. So when you look at diversity, it is very expansive. The factors that make us different are limitless. And every single day we are adding on to them, especially because of power of choice, as people are able to pick up identities and drop identities. And of course, as we fight for justice, for fairness, equal and inclusive societies, the more issues of diversity become very expansive, very complex, and multifaceted. So diversity is really a conversation of, it's a human reality. It's a reality of life because, interestingly enough, I find that as humans, we are the most intelligent part of the creation. The creation themselves have been able to embrace diversity. Actually, our world thrives because of diversity. That is why we recognize the Convention on Biodiversity. And we are actually signatories to these conventions globally, the CBD, in terms of ecosystem diversity, species diversity, genetic diversity. But us as human beings, we struggle with human diversity. The things that make us different are the things that actually polarize us. make us really get into conflict, into war, and we will see why. But diversity is a human reality. The other thing I will say about diversity is that diversity is neutral and diversity is amoral. I.e., diversity is not good or bad. It is not, in terms of morality perspective, it is amoral, it is neutral. Diversity is neutral, but it becomes bad and becomes an emotive conversation when you use the factors of diversity as merit factors to give an individual access to a resource or to deny them access to a resource because they are different, or to give them access to an opportunity or deny them opportunity because they are different, or to give them a right to enjoy a right or to deny them a right that they should be enjoying. Then the issues of diversity then cease to be neutral or amoral, and we get into the question of morality. So that is diversity. Then what is inclusion? For me, inclusion generally in terms of life, I like to say inclusion is allowing people to be invited to the table of life, to be able to participate optimally to their full potential in the table of life. And of course, inclusion also becomes contextual when it comes to the spaces, social spaces, political spaces, economic spaces. Then we can talk about inclusion all the way to the granular level of, am I included in a family? Am I included in a religious community? Am I included in the marketplace? So inclusion is an issue that means that I am invited to the table. But beyond inclusion, and Nene will speak to this much more, is belonging. It is one thing to invite people to the table. It is another thing to give them a voice and to say your voice matters. We don't only see you, we hear you. That is inclusion and belonging. And you find that no matter how well we have legislated inclusion and diversity and anti-discriminatory laws, then we have failed in the area of belonging, where we say, my voice matters, and I am heard, and I'm allowed, and I'm supported and allowed to participate. Then what is equality? Equality is when we say that all differences that make us unique or similar are equal in the eyes of any, before any measures. Of course, we like to say, oh, we are all equal before God, we are all equal before law, we are all equal before our collaborative governments and other platforms. We talk about equality, but we know indeed in reality, people are not equal. And we can see the manifestation of this lack of equality evidently in human progress. Issues of poverty, exclusion from development, exclusion from employment, inclusion from means of livelihood. And this has created then socioeconomic differences, wealth gap, gender pay gap, and other forms of gaps. So, and because of this issue of lack of equality, then we introduce inequalities. So equity comes in. Equity is the process of eliminating barriers towards equality. Equity recognizes that certain individuals and groups of peoples have been marginalized. And therefore, even though they could be minority in numbers, let's say like women, we still call them minority in terms of participation in life. And therefore, we introduce initiatives to give them a helping hand or a supporting hand in terms of equity initiative, so that they can progress and move towards equality or make some reasonable or minimum gains towards equality and full participation in life. So that is the issues of equity. When you look at our workplaces and our societies, we know and we've been told from research that diversity is important. Actually, from a logical perspective, human beings will talk about diversity and say it is important. Why? Because diverse groups of people or diverse teams, even at workplaces, outperform homogeneous ones in all aspects of performance, whether it is revenue, whether it is profitability, whether it is impact and outcome, process improvement, in every single way, innovation. They even outperform, even in governance, we talk about diversity, and we are pushing for diversity at the level of governance, mainly in form of gender issues and cognitive diversity, because then we are able to be better in governance, we are able to be better in risk management, transparency, inclusion, because of diversity. So in terms of the logic of diversity, the reason why diversity is important, we understand that as human beings. But now practicing diversity in every human interaction, tolerance, including everyone, that is where our challenges are. Today, we shall look at organizations and what level of competencies they are at in terms of inclusion. And especially today has become a global village with global trade, career mobility, talent fluidity, the issue of collaboration across continents, virtual teams like now, and even before there were virtual teams, multinationals, MNEs, working and operating from many continents and geographical areas. The issue of diversity and inclusion is critical for them because of cultural intelligence, fluidity of movement and entering markets. So you find that for them, diversity is an issue of performance issue. The public sector itself, in terms of human progress, diversity is important because every single citizen and every single group wants to feel included. So when we look at inclusion, the perspectives of inclusion and diversity can be looked at generally from 6 angles. As I summarized, these 6 angles are from the level of compliance and risk management issue. There are those, the very entry, the fact that we have got legislation on inclusion and diversity, anti-discrimination, and sexual harassment policies and such. Then some organizations or communities or collective groups, they just embrace diversity and inclusion only for the sake of compliance, so that they're never caught on the wrong side of the law. Not because it's an ethical issue, not because it's a value issue, or because they want to create a much more just and fair society. The other group is mainly MNEs, but also some of the SMEs, embracing the fact that we need to create a great place to work because diversity and inclusion is a talent issue. We know that diverse and inclusive workplaces tend to attract and retain talent better because they are much more open, they are much more collaborative, they are much more, every voice is heard. The employee voice matters. And their leadership ethos is that of partnership, not of command and control. So it's a talent issue. Another category, the third one, is the one that looks at inclusion and diversity, like organizational health and a performance issue, where they want to improve risk management, innovation, creativity by actually embracing diversity in their teams. Number 4 is the organization, especially in the development sector, but everybody should be embracing this in this era of SDGs, the issue of sustainability and being SDG smart. So you find that, I hope we are all together. You find that in terms of sustainability, inclusion is a sustainability issue. When you look at SDGs, they all have an inclusion factor. 17 goals that make SDG, 169 targets. And with their inclusive issues like gender issues that have been given a specific goal, goal number 5, gender equality. But when you look at the lenses of human progress, human development index issues, you will see that the issue of SDG and no one left behind, because that is a critical principle in SDG, no one left behind in human progress for the sake of peace and prosperity, then inclusion is really an SDG smart issue. So for those organizations embracing sustainability and SDG, they are looking at inclusion from that perspective. The 5th aspect or lens of looking at diversity and inclusion is that of competency issue. Especially again for MNEs and organizations that are operating across borders and across cultures. They are multicultural, intercultural. They look at diversity and inclusion as a leadership competency in terms of cultural intelligence and cultural smart or fluidity of culture. So they look at it from an organization competency and leadership competency and team competency to be culturally smart. So they introduce diversity and inclusion from that angle. Then the final one is a CSR, corporate social responsibility. When we are doing our sustainability reporting, and we are doing also, we want to look, we are responsible social citizens as an organization, then we do put one of our values as diversity. But is this just a value on the wall, or do we live the spirit of that value? And you find organizations that have abandoned diversity and inclusion as a CSR issue because they look at it, when you look at it from CSR angle, it's tokenism. It's just really tokenism. It's a vanity project. It is not a strategic initiative in terms of inclusion. So those who have actually want to live the spirit of inclusion and diversity, they have moved from corporate social responsibility to what we are calling corporate social justice. And we will see more and more of this. They are looking even, not just diversity as a value, they are looking at it in terms of how diverse not only our employees, our customer base, including their supply chain. Is there diversity and inclusion in their supply chain, in their partnership? Funding organizations, how is their mix of funding in terms of diversity? If they fund SMEs, how are they funding them? Is diversity a critical lens? So for them, it's not a CSR, it's corporate social justice, whereby they want to move the dial towards creating a more fair, just, and an inclusive world, not just ticking the box. So from that framing, we can see that diversity and inclusion is with us, and we need to have these conversations. And much more so when we come back to every human interaction, whether from family level to a social setup, to community-based organization, to engagement and participation. In Kenya, one of the principles that we have in our constitution is public participation because of inclusion. Every voice must be heard. And in terms of development, no one should be left behind. So it's critical, even the way we parent, that we have to start parenting in a way that we embed the appreciation for differences and tolerance for differences. So with that, I hope Nene is with us. Nene, are you there? Okay, as we are waiting for Nene. Okay, Nene, you are on mute. Unmute yourself, Nene.
Yeah,
okay, welcome.
I was worried about our load shedding.
Oh, yeah. So welcome. We are going to go straight into our conversation now in terms of how unconscious bias ties into issue of diversity and inclusion, equity and equality. So we could maybe just start by saying and unpacking for us, what is unconscious bias?
Okay. Thank you, Ashake, and thank you so much, Vicky, and the leadership of Current Country Club. Glad for the invitation to share with you the work that I do on unconscious bias and diversity. I think firstly, the most important thing to say about unconscious bias is that as all of us have unconscious bias, I often say, oh my goodness, our lights are off, but you can hear me, hey?
Yeah.
Because I'm on hotspots.
Yeah.
Yes,
Johannesburg issues.
We can hear you.
I'm on hotspots. So, okay. So unconscious bias, basically what it means is that as long as you and I have a brain, we have unconscious bias because it's a way of a brain to make shortcuts. It takes shortcuts to recategorize loads and loads of information that the brain must process in a day. So it puts it into chunks. So unconscious bias here, it's important to say every individual, it doesn't matter, including Mary and I who are working in this field, all of us have unconscious bias. So by definition, what we mean by unconscious bias is that bias, first of all, is a subjective preference towards a particular viewpoint or belief that prevents a person from taking decisions that are even-handed. Let me give you a very light example. Bias can be positive and negative. We can have a positive bias or a negative bias. My son, when he was still in grade 7, they were giving a maths test at his school, and he's got a friend, and he was saying, Mom, I know that Aiden is his friend, that Aiden is gonna nail this test. So, and I was saying, what do you mean Aiden is gonna nail the test? And he says, you don't understand, Mom, he's Indian people with maths, he's gonna nail it. And he was trying to convince me that because he's Indian, he must automatically score high with maths. Now that's a positive bias. It's not good for him, because why should I be okay with him getting 60% and Aiden getting 90 because he's Indian? So you see, there's some positive biases. The one that gives us problems are the negative biases. So what we have to understand is that by definition, unconscious bias is defined as hidden inclination or preference that influences judgment from being balanced or even-handed. So unconscious bias is used interchangeably with implicit bias. And then conscious bias is used interchangeably with explicit bias. So there are people who are sexist, who are racist, who are all the isms that you can ever find, and they know it and they don't care. They need a different workshop. We are not talking about those. Here I'm addressing people who are not aware that their biases interfere with their decision making. And where do we get our biases? Where we grew up. I grew up in Soweto, only with Black people around me, of a particular language that we're speaking. We've got different ethnic groups, we've got different race groups. I'm biased towards people who look like me, people who talk like me. So we have to understand that bias. I always tell leaders in these corporates that bias does not make us bad people. It makes us human. That is important to note. And the reason why we have this is that we need to surface our biases. We need to allow ourselves to go through this process, because there is something called employee life cycle. The employee life cycle says, if I join your company, if I'm an employee of Current Country Club, for example, let's say I'm one of the admin people employed there. As you enter, the way the company or the organization will advertise their jobs, the way they do recruitment and hiring, the way they would do onboarding of new employees, the way they do performance reviews, the way they train, succession planning, how they mentor, who they choose to mentor or they don't choose to mentor, up until we get to the point of them exiting an organization. That whole cycle, which is called employee life cycle, we need to understand that our unconscious biases can be hidden there in each of that. Let me make it more maybe practical. There are different types of biases. We have something called confirmation bias. We have affinity bias. We have even accent bias. Do you know that there's a beauty bias? It has been proven that men who are tall, good looking, well built, and women who are beautiful, do you know that they're paid more? We've done loads and loads of surveys. When I tell you like this, somebody will say, no, you are crazy. It's actually true. There is something about the brain that cannot fathom that a beautiful person or a handsome person cannot earn less than. It's crazy. This is why many organizations and leaders are spending time and energy trying to understand this unconscious bias. So let me give you an example with affinity bias. Let me just use the one as an example to show how important it is. Let's say in my company, I'm looking for a finance manager, and I'm in a panel, and four of us are in a panel. I'm chairing the panel, and you know, one of the applicants is a young Black woman, right? Who probably speaks Tswana like I do in my language. And then she comes to an interview. In the middle of an interview, I can see she's perspiring, she's tense, she's very, you know, like we all have been through those interviews where you really feel tense. And then she's really anxious. And then this is what affinity bias does. Without me telling myself, I look at her, and then I say to myself, she reminds me of me when I was young, okay? Now, remember, I'm not deliberately saying I want to favor her because she reminds me of me when I was young. Let's say her name is Joe or whatever. Her name is Tandy. Then I say, Tandy, relax. We've looked at your CV. I know you know your stuff. Just relax. I could even say, breathe, breathe. I'm chairing most. I can say that. And let's say Tandy breathes and then she recollects herself, right? After Tandy, 15 minutes later, comes another applicant. His name is Martin. He's male. And in the context of South Africa here, let's say he's male and he's also white. Now, Martin does not remind me of me when I was young. He doesn't. I look at him and let's say he's also tense. I leave him to fry in that anxiety because in my head, he doesn't remind me. There is no affinity affinity. This is what happens if there are people from the same ethnic group as you and vis-a-vis somebody from a different ethnic group. We grew up looking at each other as different. So the favoritism sometimes is not always deliberate. This thing called affinity bias makes you to automatically look at the other person more favorably. She looks like you, she comes from the same village or from the same area as you. So this is why it's important for us to do work at an interpersonal level around these biases. Another one, which is called a confirmation bias. A confirmation bias is when you look for evidence, even if you have information to the contrary. What you believed in the first place, you are going to look for that. I'll give you a very light example. When I grew up in Soweto, my father used to say, Yini, when a man shakes your hand and they shake it in this weak, they must hold your hand tight. If they shake it weak, you must know that that man is weak, he's useless. That's how my dad used to say. Do you know how long it took me, even when I go to the workplace, when a man shakes my hand, if it's this softy little shake, I look at him the whole time. Let's say we're in the same workshop. If he does 0.5% of something that looks like weak, I say, my father was right, exactly. Can you see? He's weak.
Confirmation bias.
Looking for that. My head was looking for that. So it's important as leaders, whether I own a business, whether I'm an executive or a board member, to know that we need to give ourselves time to learn about these unconscious bias. When you are looking at unconscious bias, if you forget everything, please remember two things. One, there is something called micro-inequity, and another one called microaggressions. Whenever we talk about unconscious bias, these are almost like a package that go together. What do we mean by micro-inequities? We're talking about ways in which individuals are either singled out, overlooked, ignored, or discounted because of unchangeable characteristics. If you overlook me because I am a woman, if you overlook me because I'm of a particular ethnic group, I cannot change that. It's unchangeable, okay? But if you overlook me because I performed poorly, next month I can improve my performance. So that one is fine. I can change it. The problem is that micro-inequities is that if you are treating me in a particular way because of an unchangeable characteristic, then that becomes, and the cumulative effect of that becomes a micro-inequity. Microaggressions is everyday slights, incivilities, or insults, words that we often mention without even thinking. Now, at a practical level, let me give you an example of a micro-inequity. Let's say I join your company. Let's say you work for BP or whatever. I join your organization, and then I join and a male person joins with me. Let's say that's an organization that has to do a lot of work on gender equity or on ethnicism, and then the boss introduces two of us. It's me and Peter. And the boss says, wow, this is Peter. We're so happy to have him in our company. He comes highly recommended. He's won awards. He comes from this top university. He also comes from Harvard. And then the boss says, and this is me. We're also happy to have him. And
stops there.
And you see, and let me tell you the difficulty with micro-inequities. You cannot self-advocate. If I'm standing there and the boss said this 29 sentences about Peter and say 2 sentences about me, it's very awkward for me to say, hello, how come my sentences are only 2? You can't self-advocate because it sounds petty. However, as the recipient of a micro-inequity, it really it sticks hard. Another example that we get a lot here in South Africa around women, that you'll be in a meeting and then a woman says something, and then the chairperson says, oh, okay. And then literally about 6 minutes later in the same meeting, let's say either a white person or a male says something, and the boss says, wow, that's wonderful. Who can run with that? Wow, I like that. Now, I'm the one who said it originally. Nobody said anything when I said it. And then four people, four spaces later, somebody says the same thing, just putting it slightly different. And there's this big wow. And now I'm watching my point. My point is growing. My point is growing. People are taking my point. Now come back to self-advocacy. It's difficult for me to say, hello, but that was my point, because the meeting is going on. People now are excited about this point that you mentioned originally. The reason these things are called micro is that they seem insignificant, but they actually impact people on how people feel included. Another one is called accent, the accent bias that we find that here, you know, depending on which accent people think is the better one. If you, here in South Africa, if you speak English in a Zulu type of accent, people look at you as if you are uneducated. And I say to these leaders, yeah, no, truly, and I say to leaders, you see,
same here
the reason we need to also, the reason we also need to decolonize ourselves as Africans. Do you know that if a French-speaking person speaks in broken English, do you know what people say? That, oh, how cute. Oh, that's cute. What's cute? If I have a problem with a broken English, whether it's spoken by a Zulu person or a French person, if it's wrong from Monday to Monday. Now, it also shows how in our heads we are colonized. We need to actually stand up there and say, this must change. Another micro inequity is that, you know, repeatedly calling someone by a wrong name. If I have a team, I'm a supervisor, I've got, I don't know, 20 people or 8 people reporting immediately to me. 7 of them, I'm calling them with their right name all the time. But there's this one person, maybe comes from a different ethnic group. For some reason, my bias, I just don't take them seriously. Every time I call them with the wrong name, and they correct me all the time. We know, especially as Africans, names are important. Names say to people, you matter. You are part of us. So constantly disregarding that is actually a micro inequity. Let me give you just last 2 examples of micro inequity. Somebody presents, okay, I can just give, let's say Ruth Giroux stands up and presents, and you know, people look at, let's say she really is engaging and people love her presentation, wow. And then later Naomi stands up, and then she gives a presentation. Suddenly people look at their watches, they roll their eyes. Some of them become so immature, you would hear a sigh that they are basically saying, ah, you know, that, and sometimes if you go through that all the time and you don't know why you don't belong, you don't know why, and sometimes there are reasons. The reasons could be race, could be gender, could be ethnic group, could be anything. This is how micro inequities show up on a day-to-day basis. And then the other one that you might go and Google it, there's a concept called mansplaining. If you are in a meeting, let's say you are in a board meeting, a woman says a very important point, and then a man says, what Nini was trying to say is this. And suddenly say, oh, other people, the chairperson says, wow. So it makes sense because it was repeated by a man. Okay, yes. So that's why we say, again, micro inequities also come in there. But it's not only issues of gender on micro inequities, it could be gender, ethnic group, or race or whatever. No, so those are micro inequities, or you elevate a certain university over another. If I'm already working in your organization and we come from 2 different universities, to constantly elevate others, why? How am I supposed to be feeling? Because we are already employed there. So those are inequities, which are small behaviors. Microaggressions, I said, it's just words that you throw in. Like, I don't know, Mary, maybe
simply lack of empathy. When we lack empathy,
or you say, you know, words like you people, your people, they press buttons. Or, you know, I had a supervisor the other day saying, you know, the girls in my team, you can't call professional women girls who are adult professional women. And he was saying to me, oh, but they don't mind. You are making this corporate world to be too stiff. They don't mind because of power dynamics. But actually, no woman who's an adult would enjoy to be called a girl by somebody who's not their father, really. You know,
Yeah.
here another term here, which is a microaggression in South Africa. I constantly correct people that, for example, if you call me a non-white, I'm not a non-anything. You can't just picture it. It's like if I were to point, if I were to point James Kubasu here, and I say, look at the non-woman who's sitting here, people would say, why are you referring to them in a negative term? You cannot negate my being and call me non-something else. So, you know, or this is what in corporate world they say, that one is lightweight. Have you ever had leaders talk about an employee? Ah, don't tell me about that one, she's lightweight. What does lightweight actually mean? It means that you don't think much of them. Or, you know, these days, there is a challenge, a very stiff challenge towards what we call culture fit. To say, she's simply not culture fit. Do you know, if you were to ask people to unpack what they mean by that, you will get 20 different answers. What does culture fit mean? It depends on who is in the leadership, if there's one ethnic group that is dominant, that is in the leadership, when the CEO stands up and say, we in this company, I bet you we means people who look like him or her, who are from the same background. So when you say culture fit, you need to redefine it is fit for who. Is it
and which culture? Do you have a corporate culture with measures?
Yeah. You know, or what I also had, which is a microaggression, a manager saying, wow, on the phone, you sound so sharp and clever for a pregnant woman. Can you see? It's a microaggression. Like, when you are pregnant, what does your brain go to dry cleaners? What do you mean by that? But because people just say things. You know, I've got some Kenyan colleagues that we go with to church here. They say, you know, if somebody says Jaluo, that's also a microaggression. You know, there are some things, there are some terms that, you know, we are being taught. I can give you a list around Zulu people and Tswana people, and all of us, because we have biases. We have to actually understand that this is what we need to work towards. Now you can ask me that, so what if we have these biases? Why do we need to work hard at making these biases? Because if you want an inclusive workplace, if you want, remember diversity, like when Mary was presenting earlier, diversity is not just you need to have people of different genders just for the sake of it. It also comes with diversity of thought. If I grew up in a different area, I'm bringing a different perspective into the workplace. So my thought processes, the way I think, is different to the way Mary thinks. It's different from the way Lucy thinks or Liz. So all of us, diversity of thought brings you richness in the first place. So I see, and also my advice is that when we work on this concept of diversity and inclusion and unconscious bias, please let us consider the model that we often use. I'm sure you've come across it in various leadership programs called the head, heart, and hands. And because the head, heart, and hands say at a head level, you find leaders saying the following, that diversity is an asset. It's important for my business. It's good. And then it ends up just being intellectual buy-in. So the reason why you have to align the head, the heart, and the hands is that the head is there's right things that we say. But then the biggest mistakes is that leaders leave them there. Right now, with the Black Lives Matter, a lot of companies and CEOs, they produce letters of support. This is what we do, is that we are supporting Black Lives Matter. This is what we stand for. We condemn the brutality of the police in, all over the world. This is what people are saying. Watch this space. After about 3 months, that was a hype. After 3 months, people forget that there was a hype called Black Lives Matter. That's when you don't align the head, heart, and hands. Now, when you align that, you'll say, since I wrote a letter and I say we stand by the Black Lives Matter, we condemn what happens, you cannot stop there. The heart, therefore, is what we call the emotional buy-in. What is it? So what? So what after I wrote a letter? So what after I said to people, this is my statement of commitment? You then have to say, what does it look like to integrate it at an emotional level? And that's where inclusion comes in. That in my organization, what is it that I'm going to do that is sustainable to keep the momentum? That is why Black Lives Matter people are saying this is not a moment, it's a movement. It's not just something that happens now, it has to be ongoing. So once you've integrated with the heart and then the hands, then is what is called behavioral effort. What is it that you need to change? What is it that you need to implement? And that might mean that there's certain policies, there's certain systems and procedures that need to change. Because we tend to think that when we've been to a workshop and we've done a dialogue on unconscious bias, that things will be sorted out. They don't.
You have to change structures and policies.
Yes, let's say James and I, sorry James, I'm just looking at names on my screen here. Let's say James and I work in the same department, in the same organization, and we've done good work at an interpersonal level. We respect each other, we've done dialogue. And then tomorrow, we more or less do the same work. And then I discover that our boss pays him 30% more than me. Do you know that it doesn't matter how much interpersonal work we've done? I start looking at him and I'm saying, how come this system favors you? How come you are a recipient of unfairness, right? Even underline the following. James might not agree with the fact that he is paid 30% more than me, but I don't know who to get angry at. He is the closest person because he is the recipient of unfairness. So that
he represents the unfairness for you. He's an object of unfairness.
Yes, every time I see him, I see unfairness. So for me, that is why we're saying organizations cannot leave it to employees to go on these dialogues on their own. They must also say, how do we dismantle the barriers to equity that are sitting in the policies, practices, systems of organizations? You find companies that have excellent HR policies, very good HR policies, but because these policies are implemented by managers, then you find managers with inconsistent application of policies. And that's where now then unfairness creeps in. That even if the document itself is good, because it's implemented by somebody with bias, then the resultant effect becomes inequity. So you cannot just do work at an interpersonal level. You have to ensure that you dismantle and look at what is it that lies deep there that will ensure that we create equity in organization. I want to
Nini,
a few questions, maybe for questions. Yes.
Could you also now comment on the issue? I recall when you look at the issue of fairness and equality and movements of equality in the world and issues of creating just and fair organization, Martin Luther King during the civil rights movement said it is very possible to legislate behavior to have legislation that allows equity and inclusion. But it is difficult to legislate attitudes and morality because laws are there, but they're implemented by individuals with various attitudes and different levels of morality. Just speak to, from the South African context, you've had so many laws to create equity and inclusion. Probably you can mention some of those laws, how many there are, and then what you have gone further to do, because indeed you can legislate behavior, but you cannot legislate attitude and morality, as Martin Luther King said.
Yeah, we have since 1994, we have no less than 10 pieces of legislation that are aimed at creating equality. The super one being our constitution, of course. Then we've got employment equity, BBB, Black economic empowerment, promotion of equality. We have alteration of sex description and sex status. We have labor relations, basic conditions of, they're like, I think there are about 15 of them, okay? Now this is where the difference, why I was talking about the head, heart, and hands. The pieces of legislation sit at the head level. It's the what that must happen. You're saying we need equality, we need more Black people, we need more women, we need more people with disabilities. All those things are good and well, but where you cannot actually legislate attitude, you can legislate this, you can fine people, managers are fined and all that, but at the end of the day, unless people have bought in, unless their heart, which is the emotional buy-in, unless their heart comes with the legislation, you will do the bare minimum. What some companies were doing is to just achieve the bare minimum so that they avoid a fine, you know, and that thing therefore is not sustainable.
For the sake of compliance.
So real change is where convince people that you need to understand that the way you approach diversity and inclusion is good for your business. So what is the economic imperative? The economic imperative of having people from different ethnic groups, different gender groups, different whatever will be very, very useful. I want to leave about 5 minutes for questions, just in case there's some questions in the chat box.
And the other angle I was going to bring into this conversation is the issue of stereotypes. We know that stereotypes is a manifestation of unconscious bias. The way unconscious bias, because unconscious bias is implicit, it is subtle, it is hidden. It is, they are manifested, and it is good for us as individuals when we start addressing unconscious bias at personal level to realize that unconscious bias, implicit bias, is manifested in terms of assumptions, stereotypes, blind spot, and what you covered, covert aggression, which is microaggression. When you look at stereotypes, stereotypes is when individuals, because of a previous experience you had with a certain person, or you had about someone, you never maybe saw them, you were told, or you saw them and you had this experience with that individual. Therefore, you actually attribute the behavior, the character, the factors, and the bad or good experience you had with that person, you attribute it to the collective identity of people who look like that person, whether it is in terms of gender, in terms of color, in terms of accent, in terms of ethnicity or tribe. Stereotypes, you actually take a factor and use it to attribute to a group of people because of one individual you had an encounter with, or because of a certain context only. You don't even realize the experience was context-based, not individual-based.
You know,
and therefore from stereotypes, then we develop prejudice, where prejudice is really actually means exactly that, prejudging an individual without fact or reason. So you've already judged them without even having, even from a legal perspective, without even already hearing them or giving them an opportunity to be heard. So stereotypes, assumptions, you make assumptions about a group of people without actually any facts. Those are stereotypes, and we keep propagating them.
The biggest mistake that people make around stereotypes, and I often say, sometimes it doesn't mean that stereotypes are not true. It is the incomplete truth, okay?
Yes.
So I might have been carjacked by Black men here in the corner of whatever here in Johannesburg, and you might find that I have seen 5 times I've seen hijackers, all of them being Black men. It still does not say all Black men are hijackers. So we need to ram it in people's heads that you might have seen 5 of them. You know, the quickest example I do, because I often say, let's teach our children as well. I often teach my kids that whenever I see something good on TV, on the news about Nigerians, right? I call my children. You know why? Because all the time what they see is that Nigerians are like this, Nigerians are this and this. Because I say to my son, it's because the news doesn't tell you of the good Nigerians. That doesn't sell, okay? It doesn't sell newspapers. So what you end up seeing, you're seeing a percentage of these ones that are called problematic. And then you take that brush and paint all of them. It is our responsibility when you want to counter your bias, it's your responsibility to look for disconfirming data, to say how many Nigerian professors do I know? How many great authors who are Nigerian that I know? And you need to do that all the time, because stereotypes can run away with your mind, and you can
Yeah.
end up thinking that all people look like that, and they don't. And often another mistakes that leaders do, just here in South Africa, they'll, and you know, somebody will catch themselves having said this, would say, "Ish, black people." And then because I'm standing next to them, they say, "Not you, Nini, you are not like them." That is the problem. That is the problem. You cannot say black people are like this, or Zulu people are like this. And then you look at me, or Tswana, because I'm Tswana, to say, you know, Tswana people are like this. Then you look at me, so, but not you, Nini. You've already said they are like that.
Yeah.
So it's
Absolutely.
like train ourselves. Let us train ourselves the language, because we hurt people with this language. And often issues of micro iniquities, you hear the ones who are perpetrators are the ones who will always say, but don't take life too seriously. I don't allow these things to bother me. And I challenge them all the time that you have the luxury of saying that because it's not pointed at you. You have the luxury of saying, don't take life too seriously, because they never say anything about your ethnic group. It's the dominant one, or they never say anything about your race group. So all of us have to do our own work. It's like, how do I hold up the mirror? How do I do my own hard work on implicit bias?
And the other issue, the other really dominant, we have different kind of biases globally and all over the world. But the most, of course, dominant bias is the gender bias, where you prefer one gender over another gender. And of course, for me, in our case, we are addressing what we call gender binaries, male and female, because we know globally there's a recognition of a spectrum and a continuum of gender because of gender fluidity that is now being accepted. But in our conversation today, we limit ourselves to what we call gender binaries, the issue of male and female. And why it's the most dominant bias, and it's because, first of all, it's as predominantly, gender bias has inadvertently actually taken a female face. So gender bias is now being associated, of course, with a female face because it's the largest disenfranchised constituent in the world, the female.
You know why it makes it more complex? The more the gender dialogue is becoming more complex. As you know, both you and I are doing work in the US as well, because it's no longer binary language. When you complement this with religion, right? It becomes complex. My diversity, like I'm a Seventh-day Adventist, right? And in my religion, the issues as well around gender and sexuality in between, it's not easy in a church environment to talk about that and say, no, the in between, there's bisexual, there's whatever. There's also complexity there. So we also need to understand that as leaders, we need to educate. I do workshops in my church, right? I tell them that, listen, God says, be inclusive. You are not the one to judge. Show people that you can reach out and say. So even the whole thing on gender is becoming so complex because it's no longer like 20 years ago when you were just saying male or female. So there is so much in between. That is why now companies, organizations, or rather individuals, activists in gender identity, are saying when you introduce yourself, you don't just say, I'm Audrey. You say, do I go by she, her, and hers? To specify.
And the other factor, Nini, I want to bring into this conversation is the issue of idealized, as we, because it's a social problem. It's becoming actually what I call a wicked problem because, of course, of multiplicity of when so many biases interact together, it becomes complex, and what we are calling intersectionality of biases when they mix and intersect. But now when you look at a traditional African setting, in our African setting, we have male and female, but we have what we call idealized female, or the ideal boy, the ideal girl. Well, gender roles are actually social constructs. And society is changing because of the nature of our homes now, where we have to share duties. The man is working, the woman is working. So the social constructs of gender roles in terms of our culture, they are lagging behind. So we still idealize a woman in a certain way by sexualizing her body. We sexualize the female body. I was the other day talking to my daughters and telling them long time ago, if you had to work in an airline, you had to be of a certain skin color, certain body size, and all that, because an air hostess was sexualized. You know,
Yes.
it's a role which is sexualized. This week, I was actually, last week, I was having a webinar for women working in the uniformed forces and in security and protective services. And initially, one of the organizations that deals with security says that they sent a certain lady for security work, but at the reception. And the client kept sending these women back because they wanted a woman of a certain color and a certain body size. And they had to tell the client, the issue is the role and the duties is security. We don't sexualize a female body anymore in terms of specification. And they had to stand firm and say, this is a job, not an issue of sexualizing a woman body. And in terms of work and jobs and the way we are training our children, our daughters, our sons, how can we address this much more so that we stop? We have the idolized boy who is told a man should never cry, a man should never participate in household chores, or a man should not be a secretary or an executive assistant, because those jobs are predominantly for women.
Yeah, of course.
You know, that kind of thinking.
Yes,
yeah. Could you quickly speak to that?
Yeah. It has to start at home. But maybe before that, I wanted to respond to Audrey's question I see in the chat box. Audrey was saying, is there a method of or a system of identifying unconscious bias? You know, if you Google IAT, which is called Implicit Association Test, it's a free test by Harvard. If you take the test, it will show you if you want to assess your own unconscious bias on the basis of a lot of elements, on the basis of gender, age, body shape, sexual orientation, race, or anything. You take the test, and then in the secrecy of your laptop screen, it will show you your answers. You don't even have, it will show you your results. You don't even have to share them with anybody. But what I like about it, it also shows you an average with every millions of people who've taken their IAT, how unconsciously biased you are. So what I often do with my consultants here is that once a year, we do a refresher of the IAT, and you see the extent to which you are improving. So that's at a personal level. The one that Mary was asking me is that I often say, and it would also link to what Ruth is saying in the chat box, that we have kept saying that the next generation will sort out tribal issues. Like also here in South Africa, we kept on saying, you know, the Mandela kids will be better, the post-94 kids will be better. The best way of doing this is that inside our home, you know, the neuro studies show that at 6 years old, implicit attitudes are already formed in a child.
Yes.
All other experiences are filtered through this. So whoever on this platform who has a child or grandchild or nephew or niece who is 6 years old and below, please underline, please be careful what you say in their presence towards a different,
or what you do,
different ethnic groups, or what you are saying about different tribes or whatever. It's very important for us. Okay, my electricity is back. It's very important. So it's important to start at home, because by starting at home, you are checking every time. You know, my son is in high school. Whenever was in high school, he's in first year university now. Whenever he said anything about a girl that I feel that I would say, come back, what did you just say? And you correct it right there. You nip it in the bud right there. If you have an uncle, you can tribe, a different ethnic group and different whatever, and talks in an ism way, in a tribalist way, that is the opportunity right there, because otherwise we are just giving birth to the same cycle. We're giving birth to children who are like us because they grow up with us. So here in South Africa, we have what we call community circles, where we are trying to say, how can we have dialogues on changing society to create social cohesion? Because that is a lot of work, but you need to be committed. And at least if you're not committed at a society level, at least be committed in your house, that in your house, it is not allowed for anyone to say something about a different race, gender, ethnic, whatever group, even if you have issues about gay people, you shouldn't allow children to say anything bad about them, because you are instilling in that child a sense of superiority and looking at us in a, therefore we are perpetuating the cycle of prejudice.
I want to add on to that issue that biases are embedded in our culture.
Yes.
And because the role of culture is is first of all to provide physical well-being and protection. And the
Yes.
second is for emotional comfort for the group to know they belong. So culture is a way of saying who belongs to the group and who does not belong to the group. And
Yes.
also culture is a way of propagating the narratives, the symbols, and the identity of a group.
Yes.
And what happens within that group, so that you can belong to a group and you say you belong to this group or this culture or this tribe or this ethnic group, there are certain minimum norms or behaviors and standards of beliefs, actions, and behaviors that are acceptable. The way to start really changing unconscious bias against a group or stereotype against a group is to start also addressing cultural norms, fundamental beliefs, especially beliefs that no longer serves us as a group in terms of equality, justice, and fairness and inclusion. The ones that we do need to maintain are those that uphold human dignity. An individual, you dignify every individual because of their identity as a human being.
Yeah.
But we know that culture gives us what we call collective or social identities. And some of these collective and social identities no longer serve us. And usually you find that you tend to protect a social or a collective identity if you think it will protect you against a threat. And some of those threats no longer exist.
Yeah.
You know, some of those threats whereby we were hunters and gatherers, then we became probably cattle rustlers or whatever else that we do to then ensure that propagation of the groups in terms of physical well-being and provision of the well-being and access to resources. So you tend to protect a social identity or a collective identity if you think it is going to protect you from a threat, if you also think it is going to give you some form of advantage, and if you think it is going to preserve an advantage you have had, or it is going to give you an access to a resource, even without being merit-based, because you belong to that particular group or that social class or that ethnicity. And that is why the issues of equality and fairness and justice must be more and more conversations of merit, and much more saying that now and resocializing individual into a higher collective whole. And I want to give an example of maybe a country like Singapore that has had Malaysians of Malay origin and also the Chinese origin. And the founder of that nation said we must resocialize every Singaporean into the Singaporean culture, not the Chinese or the Malay that were there, because there were a mix, or even some of the Asians that formed the Singapore population. So when an individual buys to a higher collective identity, then by choice, they will drop the lower identity when they see it is no longer serving them.
Yeah.
So on the issue of tribal and ethnicity issues, then we have to start saying, what are these issues that are no longer serving us? Because other tribes are not a threat to us. Tribe is not a factor of accessing a resource or a privilege or for keeping a certain advantage. But if we don't do that, then definitely, consciously, because of our way our brain is wired to protect us, to keep us from threats, then we tend to flee towards our tribal cocoons because of the issue of protection. And the culture continues to propagate. And then, of course, as parents, we continue to parent. I say we parent our children in accordance to our biases. And then we pass over these cultural norms and belief systems from generation to generation. That is how biases become systemic, structural bias, and institutionalized. Because even when we come to then even developing policy, the individuals developing a certain development policy, using their biases, they embed their biases into a policy.
Yeah.
And that's why you see today in the civil service, in the development sector, we are now saying, can we look at all policies with a gender lens, for example? Whether it's a policy on climate change, poverty eradication, social development, access to financial instruments and other things, are we able to use a gender lens because of previous biases that were embedded into that policy? And a certain group of people continue to pay penalty every time that policy is implemented, and therefore bias becomes systemic.
Yeah, I think I can see we're way beyond our time.
Vicky, could you sound us in terms of telling us how much more time we have to respond to the questions? I was trying to address the question of ethnicity and tribal issues that came up in the morning.
Okay, I think we can give it about another 10 minutes so that we can shut by 8:30.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So any questions from the participants in the chat, in the Q&A, or any comments that you'd like us to, myself or Nene, to address before we wind up?
Can I just give 2 tips?
Yes, please, Nene. Go ahead.
So for me, one of the things and it's unintentional, is that as we are creating equity as well, you don't also want to move to the other side, like what is happening because of gender equity, like organizations who have programs like bring a girl child to work, do this with a girl child, inadvertently then you ignore the boy child, right?
Yeah.
So you don't also want to move. And I'm saying like this because I'm a parent of both a girl and a boy. And I can see that what it's actually doing is that, I mean, he'll end up saying, everything is for girls, everything for girls. You don't want to recreate a new problem while you are correcting another one. So that's
Absolutely.
also an important thing to focus on. And then the last one is that in terms of, if I were to give you one practice that you can do, let's say somebody of a microaggression towards you. We give a tip that if you are a recipient of a micro iniquity or unfairness or microaggression, number one, give the person, because we are talking unconscious bias, give the person the benefit of a doubt and give them feedback. Assume best intentions. Assume that this person has used this word or this term because they don't know that this actually impacts me negatively, and then give them feedback. Of course, if they receive after feedback, it's a different story. And then that's when you are the recipient. If you are the perpetrator of a microaggression, if somebody tells you that you said this to me as a woman, when you say this to me as a woman, the tip is that you must own the impact of your behavior. You mustn't say, I didn't mean it. You must own the impact of behavior. I know that if you feedback, you will listen. And then the third part, so the first one, if I'm the recipient, the second one, if I'm the perpetrator, and the third one, I am neither the recipient nor the perpetrator, but I am the observer. Let's say Mary and I are friends, we're together, we heard some sexist comment towards a man. I cannot say my mouth was shut, it's Mary who said it. The power of proximity, I am next to her, she is my friend. So if we are from the same ethnic group, and Mary says something about a different ethnic group, she is my friend, I'm close to her, I should take it upon myself to actually chastise it, to say, you know better. I need to be an upstander, because we go by the principle that if you have seen it, if you have heard it, you own it. You can't say it's not, you own it. If she said it next next to you, there's power of proximity, you also own it. So that's how we can begin to change a culture and create more inclusivity in our organizations. I will stop here.
Thank you. Just to add on to Nene's conversation, that the unconscious bias, especially, it's really an issue of raising awareness. What is unconscious, making it conscious, is a question of raising awareness. And usually when I teach the inclusive leader class, usually we find that in terms of leadership, you're asking the leader, first of all, to raise awareness on their own unconscious internal conversation. And then after moving from awareness, then want to actually create to develop themselves in terms of development, in terms of creating mindfulness, practicing empathy, because some of the racial slurs or rather jokes that we make or comments in the language that we use, and we have adopted it and thought we have normalized that language, is actually laced with a lot of bias. And I will give even a plain thing, like, for example, when you're advertising for a job and you say, "This is a powerful position," that is already a bias-laced job profile, because you should use facts, not statements, not what we call just blanket statement or bias statement, or they're like blood. You can never tell when you say it's a powerful position. First of all, many times we find that when you advertise a position as powerful, many women will not apply. The reason they will not apply is because sometimes they relate power with politics, and they don't want to play organizational politics because they have seen what goes on around that. So instead of saying this is a powerful position because it will command, and you're in the sense is because of how much budget it commands, you need to rephrase that sentence and say, this position will be in charge of $5 billion per year. So you have actually defined what power meant. And you will find that the moment you put it in facts and figures, a woman who loves to work with figures and is a qualified accountant will apply for the role. While previously, if you just called it, this is a powerful position, and you leave it as that, they won't apply to it. So we are saying, leaders, then raise your awareness to even plain language that does not look like it's rude, but then also there is language which is rude to use. So you raise awareness, then you develop your mindfulness to it. Then the other skill is the issue of emotional intelligence, observing your recipients when they are receiving your message. Are you causing offense because of using bias-based language? The third thing is what we call amplification. You amplify the voices of unheard people in your team or in your group. So there's this individual who have said something, but they were never heard. You repeat what they have said and attribute them as the source. Attribute the source of that information as this individual. So call them by name and repeat and say, has Joyce has said, has Rhoda said, has Joanne Irongo said. I am amplifying what Joanne had said, even though nobody had or acknowledged Joanne saying it. We call it amplifying unheard voices. So these are all things that will help us challenge our own unconscious bias. Charity begins at home. Begin with yourself in terms of challenging your own biases. Practicing mindfulness, bringing awareness, practicing empathy, calling out microaggressions that are within your team or within individual. Of course, when you call out an individual, don't propagate bias anyway. Also, again, we usually say call out an individual without discounting or diminishing their human dignity. There is a way you can correct an individual and completely diminish them and abuse their dignity or discount their value. You must correct them with empathy in a way that you call out the bad behavior, but that does not, the behavior is bad, but the individual is not bad, because the power of individual, we say the power of the human race is the power of improvement, the pursuit of excellence, not perfection. And excellence is that pursuit of continuous improvement. That is the beauty of the human race. So you call them out that the behavior was bad, but the individual is not bad. So that calling out that Nene talked about. So you call out, you amplify, you practice mindfulness, you bring awareness. Any other comments from our participants? Vicky, over to you.
Wow, that was a really, really interesting conversation. I can see many people really resonated with it. Personally, I think the IIT thing is very interesting. So I want to see what kind of unconscious biases I also have. Yeah, and I like the last the last tip on mindfulness. I think the way that we're living now calls for a lot of mindful living, because we're always being distracted by one way or another. It's not the news, it's not the phone, it's not it's too much happening in life. I think we have to slow down and start being mindful of the way that we approach things. I'll take this opportunity and thank you very much for your time, both Nini and Washeke. Thank you so much. I think the topic is one that needed to be had. And I didn't know your name was Nini. I was saying Nene, because here in Kenya we say Nene.
Yeah. And I always do that too.
Yeah.
If I was Zulu, it would be Nene. But
I see.
I'm not Zulu, so yeah, it's Nini.
Ah,
in Swana.
In Swana. Yeah. In Kiswahili, it's Nene.
Okay.
Yeah. But thank you so much, Nini, and thank you so much, Mary Washeke, for taking the time, taking us through this conversation. We'll share the recording with you and, of course, with the members at large and the people who could make it today, so that they can also participate and also be aware in this. I think this is a very timely topic.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you, Nene, for honoring us and joining us in this webinar.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Okay.
You guys,
thank you so.
Have a good evening.
Thank you so much. And Vicky, feel free to share our contacts, so that if anybody would like to get in touch with us, then we are able to respond to any questions or anything that they have. And thank you so much, participants, members of Current Country Club. Thank you so much for an engaging session and for honoring us with your presence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.